Radio 4. It's 16 minutes past 9, and we come to the last in the present series in which Antony Smith takes a sideways look. In this talk, called A Sideways Look at the National Health Service, he discusses the problems of keeping Britain healthy.
I think part of the trouble with really colossal organisations is that the rest of us can't keep a watching brief on their finances. And one reason we can't do that is because we don't really understand what a million is, let alone the tens of millions or thousands of millions that they talk about. If we're earning, say, £4,000 a year and we work for 45 years, we'll handle just £180,000 in a lifetime. That's not a very large figure, but even a lifetime isn't big. It's 26,000 days, more or less. It certainly isn't anything like 1,000,000 days. For that length of life, you'd have to have been born in 760 BC. These thoughts come to mind in connection with the National Health Service. That's now costing us £6,500 million a year. Have you any idea how much money that is? It's my belief that the train robbers were taken by surprise on realising just how much money £2.5 million was. Well, if it's any easier at giving you some idea of the NHS bill, I reckon it would need the capacity of 235 juggernauts just to transport the annual sum, if it were all nicely stacked up in £1 notes. Worse still, no one's saying that 6,500 million is anything like enough. The doctors aren't saying it. The hospital boards aren't saying it. And certainly the patients waiting for hospital beds, paying for prescriptions and watching the dental side of the NHS disappear, certainly they are wondering where all the money goes. Also, no one says that medicine is going to get any cheaper, so we're not just having a difficult time, a bad patch. There's every chance that more and more of our money relative to the total national cake will have to go towards the National Health Service. So what? Isn't health what we all want more than anything else? And isn't it worth every penny we can spend on it, either individually or as a state? Shouldn't there be kidney machines for all who need them and open heart surgery and the very best for everyone? The answer is no. Just that. Whether we decide to raise the NHS allocation to 10% of the gross national product or 12%, there will never be enough money in the kitty. Medicine is like that. There always are newer and more expensive treatments just round the corner. And more time could be given to each and every patient. And should people ever have to die in a public ward? But the National Health Service is not an open-ended commitment, as some thought it was going to be in those heady days of 1948 when it all began. It can never be. So, what's to be done? Well, I'm happy to confess here and now that I've no idea, save that I don't much like other people's, in the main, little ideas. They say that nurses should be given more authority, that there should be a type of foot doctor, less qualified than the standard variety, but able to do most of the work, that a lot of wide-scale screening should go, that we should be more callous about, for instance, the most congenitally malformed, that various items, including the pill, should not be on prescription, that the administrative bureaucracy should be trimmed, and on. With such a vast organisation, it's very easy to suggest, to find fault. I wonder, instead, what would happen if it was called the National Sickness Service? After all, that's what it's all about. Doctors have been taught about sickness, and that's a major interest. You don't go to a hospital or a doctor unless you're sick. And that sum of 6,500 million goes towards the sick. Well, if it was called the National Sickness Service, then perhaps we ought to have a real National Health Service, one whose interest was in health, the promotion of health, the maintenance of health. The Sickness Service doesn't do that. As soon as we show signs of health, they send us home and only express an interest when we get sick again. So how would the Health Service go about its task? Let's give it a budget to start with. Let's say £1,000 million. It's a sizable sum, but still a small fraction of the amount spent by the Sickness Service. How to spend it? Well, what about propaganda for a start? Every medical man I meet says he spends most of his time trying to undo the harm that people do to themselves. They smoke too much, they drink too much, they drive their cars into each other, they carry far too much fat around with them, and they eat many of the wrong foods. Without going into the spoil sport aspect of such propaganda, which would ask us to cut down on the very things we apparently enjoy, would it be effective? I think it would. Ask any advertising man just how much space, airtime and hoarding time he could fill up for £1,000 million. If he could make certain that only 5 people sat in the surgery where 6 had sat before, then he'd have spent the money well. By keeping people healthier, he'd have cut down on the rarely colossal bill of the National Sickness Service. To take a smaller and specific example, that of venereal disease. They say it's like an epidemic now. Everyone knows about antibiotics, and it would seem no one cares too much about the prospects of picking up VD. I remember, as a raw recruit in the Air Force, being told to get fell in and bring your towels. You might need them, they said. We might indeed. That afternoon's movie was a horrific little item full of close-ups of gonorrhea and syphilis. It seemed we could get these things just by borrowing someone else's cigarette, let alone embarking on anything more exciting or promiscuous. A few of us did have to use our towels. Almost all of us could hardly say hello to a girl for a week, and I'm sure that none of us have ever forgotten the film we saw. What of VD propaganda now? Is there more than ancient posters half stuck to the walls of public lavatories? The expenditure can't be more than a few thousand. The cost of venereal disease must run into millions, and the advertising men could lessen that enormous bill. It presumably pays to advertise. If not, it must be the biggest confidence trick of all time. If it does pay, then why couldn't it pay with health? It's said that driving accidents, which are the biggest single cause of death among the young, cost £1,000 million a year. That's with the highway code, double yellow lines, police patrols and all the rest. Of course, the hospitals are very competent with the injured. But I wonder if 100 million spent on propaganda to make people better drivers would cut down accidents by 10%, by a tenth of their total cost. If not, it would have been a waste of money. If so, we should perhaps think of spending 200 million and giving that a go. With most insurance schemes, there is a relationship between the degree of risk and the benefit. Young men pay more for their third-party car cover because, so the insurance companies argue, they have crashes more often. A man in poor health pays more for his life cover. An older man also does so. For national insurance, in theory, we all pay the same, more or less, women paying less and freelancers paying more. But there's no difference according to risk. A smoking, heavy drinker carrying an extra 2 stone around with him pays the same as some lean, abstemious, early morning jogger. But in one sense, the unhealthy man is paying more for his pleasures. He is taxed heavily on his cigarettes and on his drink, and some of that money is, in return, paying for the cost of his getting ill. What isn't taxed in the same punitive fashion is food. It's hard to tax food as if it were a luxury, and anyway, it's the excess food that ought to be penalized. Fortunately, there's an easy way of checking on excess. Put the person on a weighing machine. Anyone more than, say, 10% overweight would have to pay for the pleasure by paying a greater national insurance premium to compensate for the greater risk of all that extra fat. We don't rarely object to an MOT for cars, but I suspect we'd throw up our hands in horror at the idea of an MOT for people. It is our fault if tyres wear out before their time, forcing us to buy another set. It's also our fault, time and again, if a particular style of living causes us to be a greater burden on the sickness services. A National Health Service would, I feel sure, be very keen on every inducement to keep people healthier, through their minds or through their pockets. Why do we live so long, and why are we so healthy as we are today? Primarily because of the health measures we've already taken. We have safe water, sound milk, reasonable air, efficient disposal of sewage, inspected food and fair education about hygiene, diet and how to live. They're all preventive measures, which are so much cheaper than cure. So too are the vaccinations, which must cost peanuts relative to treating the diseases. We'd be doing very nicely when compared with earlier centuries if we had no hospitals at all. Practically all of the reduction in mortality is owed to those measures I've just listed. Practically nothing, in percentage terms, is due to modern medicine, to the new drugs of the last half-century and to the new techniques of surgery. In other words, prevention has a staggering track record. It has proved itself over and over again. It costs virtually nothing, and it's certainly not in the same league as the price of cure. It's the cost of contraception set against the cost of an unwanted child. One is nothing compared with the other. Considering the amount we pay for them, it's very disappointing that we seem to get so little from our modern sickness services. People in England in the last century, once they'd got past the hazards of childhood, which were considerable, didn't just keel over and die at the first whiff of disease because they didn't have our lovely drugs and hospitals. They lived almost as long as us. Over 100 years ago, a 50-year-old man could hope to see 70. Now he could hope to see 73. The same is true more recently. In Canada, a wealthy country, a 20-year-old in 1941, that's before penicillin, could expect to live to 69.6. By 1971, when costs of medicine had doubled again and again, he could expect to reach 71.8. He's paying an awful lot for those 2.4 years. In fact, if they were rarely to economize, to forget all the antibiotics and every expensive device and procedure that had come along since 1941, the adult Canadians would just lose those 2.4 years and have a lot more money to spend. Some of it could go on extra prevention and make the loss of years smaller still. If there were a national health service, apart from promoting prevention wherever possible, I think it should also try and find a way of defining health. It's all very well saying that people live to 71.8, but what about all the days of sickness, either near that time of death or earlier? If someone has senile dementia for the final 10 years of an 80-year span, there doesn't seem too much advance over someone who just dropped dead at 70. It might be more revealing if every day of sickness were subtracted from the total lifespan. That dementia 80-year-old would then go down in the charts as dying at 70. In this way, we might get a better idea of our current medical progress vis-à-vis 30 years ago or even 100 years ago. I suspect we're healthier now for the main part of our lives, but unhealthier than our predecessors as we get near to death. We're kept going for rather longer at this time of dying with modern aids than was possible for our grandparents. Anyway, the health service would surely care most about healthy lives and not just length of life. As names are important and influential, I cannot imagine we'd be impartial about the National Health Service and the National Sickness Service. If the sickness people were getting £6,500 million a year and the health people were getting 10 million, we might wonder if this were right. And if we doubled the health amount and thereby brought down the need for sickness money by more than that amount, we might wonder even more. I know I would. By the way, if that 6,500 million still doesn't mean very much, and the thought of 235 juggernauts stacked with money also doesn't help, let's say that it's the same as £17 million a day, or £700,000 an hour, or over £200 a second. Whichever way, it's a lot to pay for being sick. I wonder what we currently pay for health.
That was Antony Smith with the last in the present series of A Sideways Look. He'll be looking sideways again in April.